Hello, welcome to this live broadcast. So I know some of you will be watching this in the future, but for those of you who are here right now in this moment with me and with my team, thank you so much for joining. Whew, it's so funny, before doing this with you today, I've been reflecting on what are some of the most important things that I could share. And I'm going to go through a few different things that came to me very intuitively. So everybody's story is different around being in an empath narcissist dynamic. You may not even really identify yourself as an empath, but you may have signed up for this broadcast because you have been in some imbalanced power dynamic relationships, or you've been in some toxic relationships. And I wanted to share, before we start off, one thing that struck me but didn't surprise me at all. One of the bonus interviews that I've recorded for this 2020 version of Empaths Narcissists, because this is the third year of the course. So I've added a couple of bonus interviews, two great ones. And Diana Edwards is one of those, and she is a psychotherapist. And I asked Diana in the interview with her and the conversation, I said, how many people do you see this dynamic play out with all of the people that you work with? And she said, I've never not seen it. I've never not seen this power dynamic at work in a relationship. And one of the things that I'm highly aware of with this whole conversation, and you see it out there on the internet, there's a lot of, oh, they're a narcissist, evil narcissist, and I get it. And I'm not in any way trying to take away your pain if that's where you are. And trust me, I was there. I sat nice and deep in the victim stages of my healing and my recovery. I really did. But one of the things that I think we are a little too quick to do when we do that is we put boxes and black and white labels onto a dynamic that is anything but simple and black and white and boxable. It's very, very complex. And it's complex because I think power imbalance shows up in every relationship on earth, not necessarily because another person is a narcissist, but because we as a culture have all grown up through this distorted way of relating to each other. And sure, there's beauty and there's harmony and there's love and there's generosity and there's kindness. And there is also meanness and degradation and power over and competition and scarcity and judgment and, in the worst cases, abuse, whether that's verbal, emotional, psychological, physical, sexual. So it's a very personal dynamic. And I'll be completely honest, when it was suggested to me by a team member a few years ago that I should create a course on this dynamic. In fact, I don't know if the team member wanted me to create a course in it. I think they wanted me to do some kind of broadcast. The reason they suggested it is I had done a few videos where I had talked about this dynamic in energy terms and what's going on and what you might be going through as you're trying to recover from it. I've had personal experience, and I also, as you often do when you work in the healing realms or in the therapy realms or self-development realms, people come and find you for the things that you perhaps already know or are good at. So I had a lot of people coming to me and bringing this dynamic to me. I never put myself out there as someone who worked with it. It just naturally happened over time. But I'll be completely honest that when it was suggested that I create some work around it, because I'd had this one video that seemed to have been viewed a lot on Facebook, I think it was at the time in 2017, and there were lots of comments. And of course, Trump had been elected the year before. The Me Too movement was bringing a lot of the shadow of power abuse to the surface. So we were culturally going through this sudden awareness of narcissistic personality disorder, toxic behaviors, power issues in relationships. I didn't really want to do it. I understood it would be good to do it. I understood there was a call for it. We were getting lots of emails into the website. The reason I didn't really want to do it, if I'm honest, is it's not the most fun topic. And not that I'm always looking for fun, but there's sometimes a heaviness and a grief energy to this topic that I wasn't particularly sure I wanted to walk back into, having spent so many years of my own life kind of recovering from what I'd gone through, but also walking other people through it. I have to say, it was one of the best decisions I ever made, because not only did I experience through the creation and the curation of the course several new epiphanies about the dynamic based on other people, based on the people I'd worked with, based on what I'd seen, what I'd heard. But I also am really grateful how many people have enjoyed and experienced the course. So the course in itself is a recovery program, essentially. And the reason that we like to run it live, because the first year we left it on the website, but the reason that we now close it each year and then like to run it live is twofold. Me and my team get to hold and curate your experience over the 2 months that we're delivering you all the modules. You also get to have the sense of community of everybody else who's going through it, and the help that everybody gives each other via the private Facebook group or the comments inside the private course itself. For those who don't use Facebook, is invaluable. So I have to say it's been one of those amazing experiences to go through. But the reason I share that is I know that this isn't the easiest topic to come to. I think emotionally it has a weight to it, and it can often have a sadness and a grief and a trauma to it. But it's so important from my perspective that we understand the dynamic, that we go beyond saying, oh, my ex is a narcissist, my boss was a narcissist, this is what they did to me. Because when we stay in that place, when we stay in the victim state, which, by the way, is usually supported by trauma, emotion, sometimes terrible abuses, sometimes the loss of everything you had. So there are reasons that we come to the victim state. I never, ever think any of us land in a victim state just because we're making something up or deluding ourselves. We usually feel like a victim because we have experienced ourselves as a victim, either at the hands of one other person or a long line of people. But what I learned was, if we only stay there and we never understand how we got there, we never backtrack through what happened, which is often the thing we don't want to do. You know, we have a whole module, I think it's module number 3, and it's called What Happened to Me. And I'm aware it's a very emotional one, but it's you going through that process. And I remember for myself, what happened to me was something I said over and over again while I was sat in my best friend's spare bedroom, having walked away, leaving pretty much everything that I had at the time, and was in shock as to what had happened to me and how this sudden ending and everything I'd been through in the years before had occurred, because I was just in shock. So when we can actually look at what happened to me, why did it happen, what are the signs to look for in the future, and most importantly, what are the patterns of behavior in me that I'm going to need to change as I go forward? Because you don't want to lose your innocence, you don't want to lose your trust, you don't want to lose your ability to love, you don't want to lose your own joy for life. But very often when we're on the tail end of one of these experiences, especially if it's a big one, or it's perhaps the biggest in a long line of these experiences, the one that brings us to our knees, the one that takes us into the dark night of the soul, where healing, recovery, and new understanding begin. Those are the moments where we can start to figure out how to rebuild all of those aspects in our life, but we might not have them. You know, we might not have trust. We might not have love. We might not have joy. We might not even be sure what we're going to do next. We might feel so eroded and like so much has been lost, and completely confused and baffled as to why. So what we're going to do today is just go through a few key points that came to me, so that those of you who've tuned in for this broadcast and you have no intention of taking the course, hopefully you can walk away from this broadcast having a few extra pieces for your journey, for your recovery journey. And, you know, there's a lot of great stuff out there on the internet, and, you know, there's plenty of free videos and free resources. The reason that we created a course was to give people a held recovery journey, and for you to be able to go through it for a couple of months and take your time with each module. So we release them days apart and all of that stuff. But you can find all of that on the course page. But for today, I thought what we'd do is we'd start right at the beginning by what are some of the traits that characterize a narcissist. And again, it's complex and every narcissist is different, but I jotted down a few things that might just ping in your mind when you're thinking of the person in your life that you've identified you might be in one of these dynamics with. I'll add one extra piece before I go through some of these things. We can all behave in narcissistic ways. You know, all of us at any time can behave in a narcissistic way. We can all behave in very empathic, compassionate ways. But what characterizes someone who you might identify as a full-blown narcissist, or a semi-blown narcissist, if you like, is someone who is repeatedly exhibiting these behaviors. It's part of their personality, it's part of their pattern, it's part of who they are. And what can be a very interesting thing for you to look at and to consider as you're exploring your own story, as you're looking at, how did I go through that? Why did I go through that? Is to ask yourself, what kind of degree of narcissism were you dealing with? So in clinical terms, they often speak about an overt narcissist and a covert narcissist. The overt narcissist is somebody who is usually much more extroverted and bold and attention-seeking. And they're also the ones who will act out in the biggest ways if they don't get their way, if they don't like what you say. So you don't need to look very far in popular culture right now, in world leadership, to be able to identify an overt narcissist. Covert narcissists are often not quite as extrovert. They can be a bit more interior. They're a bit more subtle in how they present themselves in the outside world, perhaps, but they'll still have some of the same behaviors. So the reason I ask you to consider, have I been attracting overt narcissists or covert narcissists, is it can give you a sense of where you're at. So for example, I often say that in extreme cases, we can end up with overt narcissists in our life or attract overt narcissists. But a lot of the time, and this is what the course will focus on, a lot of the time it's our own willingness to kowtow, say yes when we should say no, say yes when we feel like we want to say no, to get bullied, to have low enough self-esteem that we will allow ourselves to be demeaned or diminished in order to stay with this person, if it's a romantic relationship or a friendship, or in order to stay in an employment situation with this person. Very complicated when it's employment, because if you're in a very vulnerable position financially and you also feel that you're in a vulnerable position in terms of employment, that gets quite complicated, the employer-employee dynamic. And that's kind of one step towards the parent dynamic. If you yourself had a narcissistic parent, that's one of the trickiest ones to deal with, because it's not something that you can easily walk away from until you're of an age where you have freedom. So we'll look at those three a little bit in a moment, but just to go through some of the aspects of narcissism and just a few basics. So narcissists often have a constant need for admiration, and it's an unfillable cup. It's something they need to inflate their own sense of self-importance, which is very different to having healthy self-esteem. Most narcissists don't have healthy self-esteem. In fact, they have low self-esteem most of the time. What's tricky about it, and why the empath and the narcissist are often attracted to each other, is they can often both have low self-esteem. It just presents itself in very different ways. So the narcissist has covered over their low self-esteem, and they've covered over it with behaviors and the way that they act, and they're very distant from it. The empath is very in tune with their low self-esteem usually, and their low self-esteem may have eroded aspects of their life, taken away their confidence to do certain things. So this is where there's this mirror relationship that has to be understood. It's why on the course, we actually show you a mirror image of the same person. In that case, it's me. So the empath and the narcissist are often mirroring each other's aspects. And when you can start to see that and start to understand it a little bit more, you start to figure out, that might be what was underneath my attraction to this person. I was trying to solve self-esteem by manifesting someone who played low self-esteem in a completely different way to the way I do, in a very extreme opposite way to the way I do. So at the core of this relationship is usually a desire for healing. And when the empath realizes they can't heal the narcissist, they usually leave, often slightly shattered in themselves, but then they get to heal themselves. So that's why this is a very big healing relationship. And for many empathically based people or sensitive people, being with someone who is a narcissist can be a great gift if the narcissist doesn't let you heal or improve them. Because when you walk away beaten, bruised, shattered, and splintered, and then you do the work that it requires to put yourself back together, you tend to think twice about trying to heal someone else again so quickly at the expense of yourself. Or as I refer to it in the course, I believe it's having a relationship with hope rather than having a relationship with the person that you're with. So your hope about who they might become is what you're actually in relationship with. Problem is you're also in relationship with their actual reality of who they are, which might be lovely Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or if someone's upset them, might not be so good. And you'll be the one that costs. So narcissists also have a very usually unrealistic sense of self-importance. So they will see themselves as very self-important. And the problem with that, I mean, it's one thing if someone's just having their own fantasy about that, but it manifests in their behaviors. So they will position themselves above others. They won't be very good in groups unless they're the leader or the top. And they will take actions and steps to inflate their own sense of self-importance without really caring what they're taking from others or what they're doing to others in that process. Narcissists usually have a huge lack of empathy, which is one of the hardest things for empaths to understand because you can't get your head around it. You're like, well, I can't believe that just happened. And that's part of the thing. It's like a wake-up call. It shows you, the empath, where you are, again, living with your belief or your desire about who this person is rather than being in reality about who this person is. So the classic example is, oh, I'm so sorry that he just, got so angry at you. He had a really bad childhood. I mean, I don't know about you. I know some people whose stories would shock you based on their behavior. So some of the nicest people I know, some of the most kind, considerate, and very other focused people I know who really centered in themselves, the stories they have about what they've gone through in life is horrendous, like horrendous. So if they could go through what they went through and still come out the other side and be these kind, generous people, so can any of us. So the excuses that we will tend to make for a narcissist are usually the excuses we've been given. So they will tell us about their great pain, about what happened to them. Oh, well, this was my pain. And if you get into an alignment with them as an empath and you're in a relationship with them, whether it's friend, lover, parent and child, employer, if you start to, in a way, believe their story and support their story, you too will let that be the excuse for their bad behavior toward you or toward others. So it's a good one to check, like the part of you that feels sorry for them rather than believing they're capable of transformation or healing. It's two different things. It's one thing to hold space for someone in your life to truly heal and transform. It's another thing to feel sorry for them or think they need to be soothed. And often what can happen is this is a hook for an empath. It's like, oh, well, I feel for them because I'm going to be compassionate towards them. Maybe if I keep being compassionate towards them, they'll change. And what you tend to see is it doesn't work. Okay, so they have a lack of empathy, which means they will be defensive and in the worst cases, aggressive about actions they've taken towards other people that hurt them. So, you know, for example, you might say to your friend Sandra, you really upset your son tonight. That was, you know, you shouted at him across the dinner table. And instead of going, did I? Well, I didn't think I did, which comes from, you know, a desire to be empathic. Sandra will go, no, I didn't. He asked for it. He asked for it. You saw the way he was defense, puffed up chest. No, I have no empathy. I have no empathy for what you're telling me about what he went through. I have no empathy. So this is actually a wiring thing in those who are quite far up the narcissist scale. So those who are wired quite, again, and I'm going to say far up the narcissist scale because all of us are on the scale. We're all on the narcissist empath scale somewhere. But those who we would diagnose with narcissistic personality disorder, their wiring is so entrenched that it's very hard for them to feel empathy for others. They might really not understand someone else's pain. So in their mind, well, I took an action that needed to be taken for the good of the group and for the good of me. No, I'm fine. I'm fine. Well, I'm telling you that Nick's in there crying, really upset. Well, he needs to get over it. No empathy. So if you as an empath are involved with someone who's exhibiting that kind of behavior, there are two things that usually happen to you. You get a bit traumatized because you don't understand. You're like, oh, how, you know, it's very strange to you. You might believe them for a while, and it might lead you away from your own empathy for a while. You might start to go, well, maybe they're right. You know, that you see this a lot in cult leaders. People who manage to convince a whole group of people of beliefs that are very different to the beliefs that this person may have come to the cult with. And that's often why cult leadership can be equated to, you know, narcissists at the top with all of these empathic beings behind who want to follow, believing that some good is going to come out of it for themselves. But so often when the whole house of cards falls down, a lot of the people in the cult are left to recover. And they have to recover. It's not just like, oh, phew, I got out the cult. It's like, whoa, I'm left with trauma. I'm left with fight, flight, or freeze. I'm left with, can I trust anybody? I don't know who I am anymore. So this is often what you can end up experiencing in yourself. Like the thing that will happen that I've seen in, I would say about 90% of the people that I've worked with who've gone through this, and I remember this myself, is you start to doubt yourself. You have been convinced to doubt yourself, usually by the person or the people involved. So you start to doubt yourself. This is commonly referred to as gaslighting. Well, you said to me that you would take the kids away if I didn't do what you said. No, I didn't. I never said that. And you're like, but you said it the other day. So gaslighting, it's like the idea that you're making something up, that you're deluded, that it didn't happen. So it's very complex. And the thing about it is that's really important to understand as an empath is the actions that are taken by the narcissist are not that complex. There's kind of a textbook set of actions, and there aren't that many of them. But what it can do to you is complex to who you are. And that's why we'll often talk about complex trauma. You know, there are different kinds of trauma. So you'll have complex trauma is usually the one where you have repeatedly been subjected to a certain type of behaviors. So it has really gone in, and there's lots of different aspects that need to be healed. You know, an immediate trauma, for example, if we have one car accident, that leaves us with a trauma, and it's one focused trauma. Not to say it won't need healing and, you know, could take time to recover from, but complex trauma is when you have repeatedly been subjected to patterns of behavior that have thrown you off center, caused you suffering, made you lose trust with yourself or other people. So that's why the fight, flight, freeze is so complex. I have to get back to my points. I realize I'm a little bit like this. I tend to speak in circular ways because I get into healing conversations. So let's come back to our list. Narcissists have difficulty forming meaningful relationships. That's just common. They have difficulty forming meaningful relationships. You know, my experiences with narcissistic behavior showed up for me in relationships with lovers and partners, people that I was in romantic entanglements with. But of course, you know, we can all look back to our childhood, and that's one of the things that Diana Edwards does so beautifully with me in one of the bonus interviews for the course. Where do our childhood experiences lead us into these kinds of relationships? It's not necessarily to blame your mom or blame your dad. It's not, again, it's not that simple, but you can actually start to see the roots of some of your experiences and behaviors as a child and how they play out in adulthood. But one of the things that was interesting for me with these relationships that I would experience is it made me come out the other side. And when I did start to date again, after a period of recovering, one of the things that I was super focused on was, what are their relationships like with other people? Because those were a few red flags I completely missed with a couple of them. I did not pay enough attention to the meaningful relationships in their life, or I should say lack of them, and lack of people that they had actual, genuine, long-term connection with. What I should have paid attention to was how many blow-ups there had been, and how many separations, and how many dead bodies there were lying around emotionally. Not literally, I mean emotionally. How many dead bodies there were in their friends and family community. And that's always a good sign. You know, I made the mistake of believing the stories I was told at the beginning. And then by the end of the relationships, I would see how that pattern was playing out with everybody. And the stories I had believed were exactly that. They were stories I had believed. And maybe if I'd have spoken to the other person, there would have been a different perspective. And I'll put my hand up and say that none of us can own a story when there are two people involved, because there will always be different perspectives. But that's why, as an empath who's recovering, you have to own what happened to you. There comes a point when you'll have to separate from the narcissist. If you have walked away from them and you're still a little obsessed by them or still thinking about them, which is normal, by the way, especially when there's been a bond and a trauma bond, there will come a point where you'll have to not make it about them anymore, which is very difficult when perhaps your survival depended on that. It's kind of why it's hard for people who've been in long-term relationships to be able to forget about the person, because perhaps your survival in that relationship depended on you making sure that you were always checking what they needed, always making sure they were happy. So then when you exit the relationship or are pushed out of the relationship, or the relationship ends, you're so hardwired to be in service to their needs. Even if you were somebody who was also kind of, you know, having a go at them every now and then, or finding your fire in small ways, if the baseline of the relationship was you needed to, at some level, keep them happy, whether that was very obvious or whether that was more subtle, it can be hard to detach. But over time, you learn to do that by focusing very much on yourself while you're recovering, and focusing very much on understanding what happened and mapping what happened, so that when you go forward, you can pay a bit more attention to your behavior as you go forward, and pay a bit more attention to dynamics before letting your emotions, your heart, your soul dive in. Because there's a lot in our emotions and our heart and our soul, but there's also a lot of unconscious healing. You know, they say that we often choose partners that will help us resolve early relationships with parents or caregivers or guardians. And so if you're aware of that, when you move into new relationships, whether it's with an employer, whether it's with a friend, whether it's with a lover or a romantic partner, if you've had some history in those relationships, go in a bit with your eyes open, and don't be too surprised if you upgrade before you completely resolve the issues. Meaning, it's like if you've had very toxic relationships in your love life, very abusive relationships, we will sometimes choose a slightly improved abusive relationship, which for us is a healing step forward. It's still not perfect, and it's still perhaps not necessarily where you're ultimately going to end up or where you'd like to end up, but you can see that it's a version 2.0 of what you were in before, which is also allowing you to change and become someone else and start to go, maybe I do want a bit more out of this relationship. Maybe it isn't enough for me that we have a happy harmony in the house if I do more of what they want. Maybe that isn't enough. So, okay. And then, of course, we come to the last point I wanted to share with you, which is the one that really is the sticking point with narcissistic behavior. It's destructive, demeaning, or belittling behavior towards others. And that can, of course, really run into super abusive behaviors, physical, sexual, violence, really, really traumatizing behavior that I hope none of you are in watching this. But if you are, it's going to be really important for you to find ways to safely, with support, step out of that relationship. And support's the key. Making sure you have other people on your side. If you are in harm's way, doing what you can to research what are the support systems out there for people in your position, because they do exist. You just have to find the courage to be able to start to walk towards them. And perhaps you have to do it very privately at first so that you can get things in place, so that when you exit the relationship, you have enough support to hold you and help move you over. But I'm hoping most of you aren't in that situation. Okay, so just to recap a couple things. The most important thing I believe that we need to do is we need to understand the dynamic, not the diagnosis. The diagnosis is step one. Again, oh, they're a narcissist, I'm an empath. Okay, great. But that's two box descriptions. I mean, and I'm not dissing it, and I'm not trying to be dismissive, or those are really important. Don't get me wrong. Finding a video or a book or something that helps you go, oh wow, I see there are some personality characteristics, and I see I have some personality characteristics. That's great. Now we need to look at how they've played out in your life. And now we need to look at whether or not they match what you want in the future. And then look at how you go about deconstructing some of those behaviors and becoming aware of them so that you don't recreate them in the future. So that's why I always say, understand the dynamic, not just the diagnosis. So it takes time. And if you're doing this and you're not going to take the course, I would start journaling. I would start asking yourself questions about what you want in, let's say, a future employer relationship. And I am aware that one thing I haven't touched on yet, and we've been talking for 30 minutes or so, there is also the importance of having certain people no longer in your life. I know many people who were not able to make peace with their parent, or with their family member, or with their old employer. And I also know many people who have never been able to stay connected to that specific ex of theirs. And it's okay. I think we have a lot of guilt and shame. And I think particularly in the spiritual community, there is an idea that you always have to be able to overcome everything. And I think it's really important to be able to forgive inside yourself any behavior that you've really held a resentment around from someone outside you, and also to be able to forgive yourself for things that you recognize, oh God, I wasn't very nice to that person, or oh, now I look back, I could have ended that relationship in a kinder way. I don't know about you guys, but I look back at how I was in the 2 or 3 years I was recovering from my biggest kind of narc experience. And I was not very, I certainly did not handle the end of a few dating relationships with as much grace or clarity as I know I would be able to now, because I still wasn't fully healed. I was still healing. I was still trying to figure stuff out. And it's not that I did anything particularly badly, but there were just a few moments that I'm like, oh, I wish I had understood more that I was healing. And that I'd been able to explain that to a couple of the people at the time who I got involved with, who didn't really understand that. And things I committed myself to too soon, and then had to back myself out of it when I realized, because I was still working out that pattern of committing to people I shouldn't have been committing to. So, we all learn, we all go through life doing different things. So forgiveness towards others and forgiveness towards self is something we all must practice. But just because you've forgiven somebody, it doesn't mean they're necessarily right to be in your life. And I know many people who have beautiful, healthy relationships in their life. And you would look at them and go, wow, they're so great in relationships. And if you sit down and have a chat with them, they'll tell you about the one person in their life, usually like a key person, who you would think they would be exhibiting more grief around. And they're like, oh yeah, I can't speak to my brother anymore. You're like, huh? And you're like, yeah, I tried. I did everything I could. And, you know, whether it was his drug addiction or whether it was his money narcissism that he kept bringing to mind, or whatever it is. So it's okay if there are people in your life that you can no longer be with. And I say it's okay, knowing that for most of you, there'll be a part of you that will always hurt. You know, it's kind of sad. Like, honestly, in my ideal world, I wish we could all like stay connected with everybody and that it was that easy. But when we're dealing with wounds and when we're dealing with wounded behavior, sometimes you just have to recognize, there is no change in this relationship, or I have changed. And so maybe they have changed, but I've changed in a different direction. And there isn't a positive outcome by having each other in our lives. So, you know, this is why I think, you know, I shared with you at the beginning, I wasn't running to do this course. Like, part of me was a bit like, I mean, I knew I needed to do the course, don't get me wrong. But part of me was a bit like, oh, you know, because the emotions are complex and we feel quite deeply through it. And I think empaths tend to be very good at feeling. Doesn't mean you always like feeling. You might feel like you're overloaded by feelings sometimes. But there's a difference when we're accessing our deep feelings that we get to rearrange. So the feelings that are buried in us, that have relationship history, that have soul history, that we then hire people in our lives to play out. You know, it's like, oh my God, I see why I manifested Brian, my employer, because he is so like that woman who I used to work for 20 years ago that was a nightmare. And I'm so glad I only signed a 6-week trial contract, because I'm beginning to see some patterns of behavior. Wow, it's giving me a healing. I don't know if I need to go through this. Oh, he said something to me that's a bit like her. Unlike 20 years ago, I'm going to say, Brian, did you mean to say what you just said to me? Because it sounded quite judgmental. Is that what you meant? Were you judging me for what I just did? And Brian might surprise you by going, oh, did it? Oh, sorry. I'm a bit blunt sometimes. My wife's always telling me. There, you have a whole new relationship dynamic in place, because 20 years ago, perhaps the slightly more extreme version of Brian really hurt you and you didn't know how to speak your truth. You didn't know how to just put a but firm boundary in place. So now you say to Brian, did you mean to judge the way I'd just done that? Because that's how I experienced it, but I just want to check. And you might shift the balance. So that's the great news about learning to recover from this kind of relationship. You learn your boundaries. And I don't necessarily mean the boundary where you're, you know, on the phone to your friend going, don't you ever come around here again? You know, I mean, maybe that conversation needs to happen. And usually we only need 1 or 2 of those conversations in our life. You know, if you haven't really put your boundaries down, there might be a very fiery moment around your boundaries with a certain person. Or maybe there's a few where you're like, oh my God, who have I become this year? I was never like this. It usually calms down and settles. And more importantly, when we hold a boundary frequency, we don't tend to get messed with in the same way. So for example, you know, just to demonstrate, well, I'll give you this example. You know how at school, I don't know if this is true for you guys, when we were kids, oh my God, we would love it when we got a supply teacher. Terrible, not very nice, but you know, a supply teacher who didn't know how to kind of hold the room. So we'd be like laughing and like we'd be talking and they'd be going, calm down. Hey, everybody, I really need you to concentrate now, you know, versus the teacher goes, you will all be quiet or you will be going to detention, you know. You're like, whoa. Second teacher holds their frequency. You aren't going to mess with that. First teacher, boundaries very woolly, very loose. yeah, we're going to have some fun with this supply teacher because we're 9-year-olds and we're, I mean, talk about power dynamics, kids. I mean, kids are battling that power dynamic every day because they don't have the power they fully want. So you see that hierarchical battle going on for all of us, which is why it's so in us, this power dynamic. So, okay. So the other thing I wanted to touch on, and I want to get to some of your questions in a minute, is time and healing. Really give it time. If you've just gone through something really bad, like it's brought you to your knees or it's made you lose your confidence, give yourself 2 years to recover. And you might be sitting there going, oh my God, I haven't got 2 years, which tells me, no, it's not that you haven't got 2 years, because it might take 2 years. What you haven't got right now is immediate support. Because if that thought horrifies you, you have not got the support in need right now, support there that you need right now for your emergency trauma response, which is what just pulsed through your body when I said that. You're like, oh my God, how am I going to cope? So you're going to put things in place in your life. You're going to allow some time every week to educate yourself. Like I said, this isn't the most fun thing to do, but you might say, you know what, on a Friday between 4 and 5 p.m., because that's the 1 hour I can designate, I'm going to take myself off to the library, or I'm going to tell the kids that I'm working, and I'm going to sit and I'm going to watch YouTube videos. I'm going to take an hour a week to see what I can learn about this dynamic, and then I'm going to spend 10 minutes journaling some notes for myself. And just, what did I learn? What did I observe? Is anything coming up for me? Any thoughts or feelings? Because when you tend to expose yourself to those kinds of teachings or those kinds of pieces of information, things start to come up. Healing starts to happen. And the reason it's good to write it down is it gives you a way of processing it, gives you a way of getting it out of your body. But equally, when you write things down on paper, you get to look at them and you get to see them. It's like, oh my God, is that what I think? Wow, is that what I went through? So if you haven't got someone who can hold space for you, if you haven't got a friend or a therapist, or you're not going to a support group, or you're not using this course, use paper to journal, to write things down, to get things out of you, to see what's going on in here. Because it can stay very invisible unless we poke around a little bit and investigate and let things come out and rise to the surface. Okay, so one last thing that I haven't really covered before we go to questions. And this is just a great general question for all of us. I mean, this runs through our whole lives. When do you say yes when you should be saying no? When do you say yes when you should be saying no? And I've got a great tip for you. If any of you just immediately heard me say that and were like, oh yeah, I'm really bad at that, let go of the guilt. The guilt's not going to get you anywhere. I am really good now at saying no when I feel no. And I'll still get caught out. It's like, it's life. We change, so what I mean by that is, I agreed to do something about, I don't know, I remember about a month or 6 weeks ago. And then I was like, I probably shouldn't have said yes to that. I see why I did. I really like the person. I wanted to help out. Trust me, didn't cost me a lot. It wasn't like a big thing, but we're always refining our yes and our no because we're always changing. Our life is changing. The world is changing. You only have to look at 2020 to notice how different our circumstances are. So us knowing when to say yes and when to say no is something we're always working on. But when you've been in an empath narcissist dynamic, you're usually quite confused about this. You've usually eroded your own sense of, what do I need? Do I really want to say yes? It goes a little skew if you're having to keep the peace. So you're saying yes to keep the peace. You're saying yes to keep them happy. You're saying yes to soothe them. You're saying yes because they aren't giving you much choice. If you don't say yes, you can feel it in their tone that there will be consequences. And what you're doing is protecting yourself from their consequences because your trauma body goes, I don't want to get told off again. I don't want to be shamed publicly. I don't want them to cause a scene when we're with my mother. I don't want to get fired again publicly. There's all of these inbuilt responses that we have. So that's why we have to heal our trauma, and we can heal our trauma in many different ways. You know, you might focus on a breathing practice or meditation. You might exercise. You might use Reiki. You might, I know it sounds simple, but it's really important. Like if you notice you're traumatized or overwhelmed, for me, something as simple as a bath, putting water in the bathtub and getting in the bathtub can really help my nervous system. So there's focusing on the trauma that the body has gone through, that it's still trying to recover and let leave your system. But there's also changing dynamics, like when you should be saying no and you find yourself saying yes. Usually when you come out of a big emp-narc relationship, you go through quite a vulnerable and difficult period of time. You know, you'd think that the part of you, especially if you left the relationship, there is a small part of you that feels fulfilled. There's a small part of you that's like, oh, phew, I managed to get myself out. But then you really have to rewire yourself. And saying yes when you should be saying no is something that can run you into trouble in future relationships. So one thing to look at in that is, if you weren't just doing it to keep the other person happy, this is a tricky one for empaths to admit to themselves. What were you getting out of your devotion or your submission to this other person? What were you getting out of your devotion or your submission to this other person? And I think it's very easy for our ego, and I certainly, this is, I would have thought this all the way. I mean, I'll give you an example. I saw a coach, someone who was coaching me with my work, and this is, you know, a good decade, more than a decade ago. And they said to me during this coaching session, they said, well, yes, they said it's quite common when you're in a controlling relationship that the one who was being controlled leaves with nothing. Because I was explaining that I'd kind of, and I fought him. I was like, I was not in a controlling relationship. I just couldn't see it because it was more covert. So I didn't want to see it either. So I ask you as an empath, what were you getting out of your devotion or your submission? And it can be really simple stuff. It can be, well, daddy always told me I was a good girl. And when I was a good girl, things felt good. So I learned to be a good girl for this person, except it didn't kind of feel good. A, because you're not a child anymore. You know, you're an adult, very different set of circumstances, but the child you might have been driving this, well, then I'm a good girl. And I know I'm good if I please daddy, or if I do these things that dad likes me to do. So it can be very complex. All of these characters inside us that can rise to the surface for healing and attach themselves to an empath narcissist dynamic. So what I'll tell you from someone who, I'm definitely the most whole I have ever been in my life. And that's certainly not something I could have said to you 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, and even 10 years ago in some ways. I mean, of course, there's always a good version of us at every stage of our life. You know, I don't want to diminish the parts of us that were performing well, if you like, in life and as a soul. But it just takes time, and it's a recovery journey. And I definitely, when I was in the dark night, I didn't believe, there were days I didn't believe, number one, I couldn't believe how painful it was for so long. Like, I remember crying every day for 6 months. And I don't cry easily. I like crying. I don't have a problem with crying. I wish I cried more, but I don't tend to cry for myself very often. I will cry if a movie makes me cry, or sometimes something for someone else, but I don't cry for myself a lot. And I cried every day for 6 months and couldn't stop it, and was just in pain like I had never imagined. So by the end of that year, I didn't really want to live. I was like, I can't do this. But what I can tell you is that the commitment I made to myself back then, and luckily for me, I knew enough about healing, self-development work, and the soul, because I had my connection to the Z's, and I had good people in my life that helped support me through it, even though, because of the relationship I was in, I'd managed to push most of them away, which is kind of what you do. especially if you're with someone who might be dangerous to them, or who has said quite clearly to many of them that they don't like them. But I managed to have this support system, and I gave it time. I was willing to recognize it would take me probably at least a year to get the first level of equilibrium and balance back. And after days of feeling like I didn't want to live, I had this epiphany moment, and I was at the little steam room at this gym that I'd been using near where I was living in this tiny apartment to try and, like, I didn't want to exercise, but I knew I had to. And because I didn't really want to do anything, I'd kind of had a nervous breakdown. I was in the steam room, and I had this epiphany, which was, if I've gone this low, if this is the lowest low I can feel in life, then I'm really curious what comes next, because I understood the law of the pendulum swing. You know, I understood that we contract before we expand. So if you're watching this and you're really in your contraction, I absolutely promise you, you can come through it. You just need to get the right support in your life. You need to be willing to give it time and research and find people to help you and share your story, whether you're doing that privately on a piece of paper, or whether you're finding an internet support group or something where you can do that. But it will take time, not just because you need to recover from what you went through, but you need to understand what you went through and why you went through it. Because when you're armed with understanding, even if, and it's likely you will attract little mini versions of it in the future, you won't dive headlong into it again. You'll be like, oh, this reminds me of this. And you'll have opportunities to clean up your behavior and your patterns in each of those scenarios as you go. So I'm conscious of time, and I've been speaking for a while. So at this point, I'm going to ask Noah to come onto the broadcast and to help us out with some questions. Hey, Noah.
Hey, Lee. That was great. Thank you for doing this tonight. I know we got a lot of appreciative people online with us tonight. I've got
we had a lot of questions too, and I know we won't get to many of them, but we wanted to take a few, right?
Yeah, I'm grateful for everyone who submitted a question.
Amazing.
And so I'll just jump right into it so we can get to as many as possible before we have to shut it down. So I think this is a good one because I think it will speak to a lot of people. And it reads, how do I not continue to attract partners with narcissistic tendencies into my life?
Well, you know, the key is you're going to have to change. One of the things that kind of the concluding module of the course is called Reclaiming Your Charisma, Power, and Joy. Because something I realized, and it partly came through my channel, they kind of showed me this when I was working with people. One of the things that you're often attracted to in a narcissist, usually narcissists will have high levels of one or all of charisma, power, and joy. Not all narcissists are charismatic, but they might be very powerful, and there might be something about the way they carry their power. They exhibit joy in their life. Whether they're really feeling it, they might be seeking it. You know, they might be constantly wanting to do things that make them feel good, even if it never really works. So reclaiming your charisma, power, and joy is usually something that you have to work on so that you aren't attracting in others. And what I will just tell you is, speak to anyone who's had narcissistic behavior in their life. Very few of them tend to stop it after one relationship. Even me, who went through some whoppers, I had a couple of little echoes like a few years later. And one of them, you know, I think I tell this story in the course. One of them, I had all my savings at the time were $4,000. And I was like, wow, I've got $4,000 in the bank. You know, I'd worked to clear all my debts, and so this was big for me. And I lent it to someone. In fact, no, I had a bit more than that, but I lent them 4,000 of it because they gave me a pity story. And of course, I never saw that money again. I never, you know, so I know it sounds crazy because I hear it and I'm like, what were you doing, Lee? But I did it because I fell into the same emotional enmeshment with this person. it's all fine. It was, as a friend of mine said, think of all the money you saved had you carried on with them. And I'm like, yeah, that's true, down the line, I guess. But my point being, you will have echoes, you will have repeats, but what you have to do is start to really look at yourself and start to really look at your own behaviors and analyze where you have allowed them to be the narcissist and where you only cast yourself in the role of empath in an imbalanced empath narcissist dynamic, because we cast ourselves in that role, especially if we're doing it repeatedly. It's one thing if you can't help it, you know, if it's your parent or you suddenly find yourself in a job and it's the frog in the hot water, which is kind of what my therapist described was what happened to me. You don't see it coming. The water is slowly boiling. So you as the frog in the water boil. You know, it's a horrible metaphor and it's a horrible image, but they say if you drop a frog in boiling water, it will jump out because it feels the water, but if you slowly turn the water up. So it's a horrible image, but it kind of, it's appropriate in a way because it's kind of how people's spirits die in those relationships. So I would really, if I were you, I would really aggressively look at my own patterns. I would devote time to looking at it, whether you work with a therapist, whether you study, whatever it is, whatever it looks like for you. And I would really start to proceed very cautiously in future relationships and have a list of checks and balances. Like one of the things I share in the course is when you know, if it's dating, for example, when you start dating again, pay attention. If you go out with them for an hour and they're mostly talking about themselves, are you going to pay attention, or are you going to just get lost in the romance of this person without really realistically looking at what's actually going on? So, you know, I learned to recognize an Achilles heel for me was emotional romantic relationships. So I had to treat myself very differently when I went on those first dates than how I had in those other situations where I'd kind of lost myself with and in another person. So good luck, and you can do it.
Thanks, Lee. The next question reads, "Hi, Lee. I'm having a really challenging time disconnecting from the attachment to my husband. October will be 22 years of marriage. We've been living in separate homes since December 2019, when I could no longer bear his Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personality. I go from being clear to being hopeful things will change. He remains unaccountable for his behavior and recently said, 'I'm making a victim of myself.' Thank you for any clarity you can offer."
Well, first of all, one of the hardest things for you to accept is going to be the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, because it's not that different to when we leave a relationship that we know isn't good for us. I'm not even talking about an emp-narc relationship. Maybe you love the person, but you recognize that it's not right for you to be together. When we feel a bit lonely, when we go into grief, when we miss them, when we miss somebody, we'll start to romanticize and fantasize about them. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's okay. It's part of letting go. We'll be like, oh, I just wish tonight I could be with them. I'd like that. You know, it's okay. I wouldn't worry so much about the side of you that is missing him, because you were together for a long time. So it's going to take time for your body to rewire and your mind and your emotions to rewire around him. I would be hyper vigilant about the side of you that will let yourself be hurt by his comments, because you have to remember that it's not true. And the thing is, if he thinks you're a victim, can you accept that? Can you go, oh, he either genuinely thinks I'm a victim or he's just saying it to get under my skin? And I absolutely accept either. I don't like it. I don't have to like it. But I accept he's going to do that, and I accept that when he does that, I'm not going to let it trigger me or engage me. Now, I'm not saying if it does trigger you, be hard on yourself. I'm just saying that's what you want to work towards. If he is belittling, if he is negative, if he is judgmental, you have to put a door to it and go, okay, that hurt, but this is that thing. I've written a note for myself, and you might write a note down and stick it somewhere visible. I will not allow myself to get entangled with his judgmental or triggering sentences, so that you remember. Because at first you'll still get freaked out, but you'll slowly rewire your mind to, rather than react emotionally, you're bringing logic into it. And your logic's going to go, it's okay, you're emotional, but remember, this is a triggering sentence, because we need that logic. We need that observer to be present when we're with somebody who we can't fully be open or relax with. If you're with someone that you trust with all your life, fine, be uninhibitedly 100% you. But if you're with someone that has proven themselves to at times be harmful or inconsiderate toward you, we need a little bit of on guard. So the other thing I would say is give yourself a break because of 2020. I think the loneliness that has come up for so many people this year, especially people living alone, has been intensified because of COVID and what that has done to the organization of the planet and society. So give yourself a break, and congratulations for being where you are, and give it time, but fill the gap. It's a bit like if you're trying to recover from a drug or an alcohol problem. You know, you won't do well if you just remove the thing that you used to spend a lot of time doing without putting something new in the equation. So ask yourself what you could bring into your life that's new, whether it's a creative pastime, a hobby, looking for some new friends you can have contact with, even if you have to speak to them online. Bring in something new that will give you some energy, which will help to replace what has been lost, which at the very least was a lot of time with this person. Even if it wasn't good time, you spent a lot of time with that person. So there is going to be a kind of echo and a relay in your body and your psyche, because that was your life for 22 years. So lots of love.
Thanks, Lee. The next question reads, I worked up the courage to leave my narcissistic husband 1 month ago, but soon realized that just because I moved out, it doesn't mean the narcissistic relationship is over. I sometimes feel guilty for leaving, and it's like I'm putting off allowing myself to completely move on until I'm sure he's moved on and is doing okay. How do I completely let go?
Well, I'll tell you, on a soul level, the best thing you can do for him, no matter what he tells you and no matter what your mind tells you, is move on. And you know, you might say, well, what if I move on and I'm happy and then he's unhappy because of that? Then he'll need to feel that unhappiness, or he won't even be affected by you, or he will beat you to it and replace someone in his life first. So the point is, it kind of goes back to the last questioner's question. It takes time to rewire our habits. And when you have been in reference to someone else's desires, needs, wants for as long as you have, it takes time to rewire ourselves. So a month is not a long time. You know, it really isn't a long time. And it's good that you're noticing that you want him to be happy. So whenever you start to want him to be happy, recognize his happiness does not have to happen at the expense of yours, which maybe was what the relationship was built on. You were saying yes for him while saying no to yourself. So we don't have to play that out now, because you two have separated. So you're no longer in charge of whether or not he's happy, or whether, not that you ever were anyway, but whether or not he finds someone else or is happy with someone else. You know, you can't control that. And if you try to modify yourself and your behavior still in relationship to him, then you haven't left the relationship. And again, I'll say this like I've said it to a couple of other things. That's okay. Don't beat yourself up for it. I mean, it takes time. And when you have hardwired yourself into this level of codependency, which is really what an empath narcissist dynamic is, it's a codependent dynamic. Each party is dependent on the other one's behavior and is doing this kind of dance. It just takes time to rewire yourself and go the other way. So you can affirm, I truly wish my ex to be happy. And if you can really say that and mean it, great. You know, you might want to say that every day. It's like doing a prayer for him. I truly wish my ex to be happy, but I challenge you to also add, I truly wish for me to be happy. I truly wish my ex to be happy. I truly wish for me to be happy. I invite my ex to be happy as soon as he is able. I invite myself to be happy as soon as I am able. So when you get those little thoughts, you know, one of the things I've learned with negative self-talk, self-judgment, and I was an expert at it, is to rewire the thought. So if I'm like, oh, Lee, you did that really badly. That was really rubbish. I'm like, oh, that's a bit heavy. Oh, that's how I used to speak to myself. That's how I was taught to speak to myself in many ways, because it's what was modeled for me. So it's like, okay, Lee, you did the best you could. So I'll rewire the negative downward thought that doesn't feel very high frequency by saying, Lee, you did the best you could in this moment. Well done. So it doesn't change the situation that just happened, but it changes my emotional, energetic relationship to the situation, which in turn changes what happens next. So I'll show you. Oh, Lee, that was really rubbish. I'll go into my next task. That's what I'm coming in with. Or, oh, Lee, that was really rubbish. Lee, you did the best you could. You did the best you could. Lee, you did the best you could. Okay. Now I'll go into my next task. Different energy. I'm bringing a different energy to my next task, to the next people. Hey, we're all human. We all have our ups and downs. It's okay. But if you catch yourself really going downward like that, because that's really what it is, going downward, worried about his happiness over your own, make some affirmations in the other direction and trust that your happiness will free him, whether it frees him to grieve or whether it frees him because he's off with someone else too. Because energetically, we're always connected in a certain way, but we no longer need to micromanage that connection when we're no longer in the relationship. And that's hard to, especially for empaths or healers or hypersensitive people. One of the things we have to learn to do is to hold certain relationship dynamics lightly rather than tightly. And we've usually held them tightly to keep ourselves safe or for some idea that we're keeping everyone else safe. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Lee. The next question reads, why does a narcissist keep creating difficult situations and leaves it to others to resolve them afterwards?
Because the narcissist doesn't think there's anything to resolve. That's the thing. You know, empaths and narcissists make quite a good team because the narcissist can go into a room and smash it up and offend everybody and tell grandma that she's an old bag. And then the empath tidies up the ornaments, strokes everyone on the back, goes up to grandma, oh, grandma, he had a terrible childhood. He doesn't mean it, you know? So that's where empaths and narcissists are kind of like this dangerous little team in a way, because the empath can often cover over or smooth over the narcissist's bad behavior. Now, does the narcissist care that the empath's doing that? Not usually when they're full blown. When they're a full blown narcissist, they're not usually going to turn around and go, oh, I'm so glad you made it okay with grandma. They don't care about grandma. It's grandma is an old bag. As far as the old bag, useless old bag, no use to me. Grandma has no use to me. That's why I will dismiss her. That's what narcissists do. They will praise, celebrate, or uplift who or what is useful to them. And they will ignore, belittle, and, you know, demean that which they think is of no use to them. So it's not that they are, it's not that they're being willingly reckless much of the time. It's that they don't have empathy or remorse. Now, the other thing I will say here, again, I'm speaking very black and white, and I can't really do that because I have met some people who have narcissistic tendencies who will have regret after they've done it, but it doesn't mean that they will always do the work to kind of dig deep in themselves to see if they can change that pattern of behavior. And that's where an empath and a narcissist can be a bad team. Because the empath will soothe the narcissist and say, oh, it's okay, you know, you tried. And then, of course, the narcissist doesn't really learn from it, doesn't really dig deep, and then gets to just do it all over again. So what you have to understand is that what you value is very different to what the narcissist values. You value harmony, connectedness, people feeling okay. That's probably not what the narcissist is valuing. And what I will say in this, again, it's a general statement, but I think one of the reasons that certain empaths are attracted to narcissists is to learn to be a bit more flippant. That doesn't mean be flippant towards people or mean towards people, but some sensitive people can be very embedded in how does the room feel? How does this person feel? So it can take a really bad relationship where you're so consumed with how this person feels and you can't believe they pushed you over or knocked you out or treated you badly, that it makes you, as an empath or a sensitive, learn to step back a little bit sometimes and to not necessarily be emotionally and energetically enmeshed in everyone else without being connected to yourself. One of the modules in the course, I named it the abandoned self. The abandoned self. And I did a whole module on it because it was one of the things that I both saw time and time again with people, but also was able to backtrack through myself. The part of me that I'd never really owned, that I would kind of hire out, if you like, or let narcissistic people park in or use to their advantage, because I'd never really owned it. So the parts of ourselves that we abandon as empaths is something for you to look at there. Thank you so much, everybody. Noah, I'm guessing, should we do one more quickly?
I was going to ask you if you're up for it. I do have one more that I think would be good to close with. Okay, cool.
We're here. Let's do another one.
Yeah, this one I feel like is good to close with. It's what is the best way to fill the energetic hole left after leaving a narcissist? I still have emotional flashbacks, unexpected crying, and just feeling lost. Thank you.
You know, there's so many stories. You know, one of the beautiful things about doing this course is me and my team got to en masse see many stories. I know there are already 500 people who are taking it this year, so I'm looking forward to seeing the stories and the sharing again. But I'll just share with you that I feel for me personally, it took about 8 years to no longer feel trauma in my body. And I'm not talking extremes. I'm talking tiny echoes, you know? And it's okay. Like, I don't think that was a failure on my part. I don't think I didn't heal fast enough, because I really did in the first couple of years make the biggest changes and leaps so that, you know, I had a chance for happiness and stuff in my relationships and in my life. But I think one of the things for you to really look at is to not worry so much about the echoes and the replays and the traumas unless you aren't doing the work to heal. Because if you're doing the work to heal, and if you're holding a space to heal, and especially I think if it's aggressive, I've used that word a few times, and it's a word I know can be triggering to very sensitive people, but it's a word someone used to me many years ago. They said, be aggressive in your healing, in your self-healing. And it kind of jarred my mind, but it also was a great wake-up call. It kind of lit a fire under me. I was like, yeah, actually, why wouldn't I be bold? And I think for you, I would be really bold around your healing practices. But if you feel like it's sometimes a mental crisis or a faith crisis, I would, again, the power of writing things down, small messages to yourself, small reminders, sticking them somewhere visible in your home. You know, I am becoming more whole and healed by the day. I am reclaiming myself every day. I am healing my inner self and reclaiming my power every day. Because what's usually a positive sign is you're having those replays because you're in a safe enough place that you can have the space to start to heal. What I would probably do if I were you, I would look at what I was doing to heal right now, and I would try to apply a change. So if I looked at it and gone, you know what, I went on one workshop 6 months ago and I occasionally watch a YouTube video, or I would probably just turn up the dial on frequency. Or if you're like, no, Lee, I'm pretty good. You know, I do yoga 4 times a week with an intent to heal, and I have a Reiki person I see once a month, or whatever it is, whatever it looks like for you, I would try bringing in some different things. I would try widening the range of what I was doing. I might look at trying a therapist. So I wouldn't worry about the replay, because if you worry about the replay, you're pouring worry on worry. The replay is the part of the body and the part of the psyche and the part of the emotion that wants to heal. And it's uncomfortable when it comes up, but what it's doing is it's also showing you that you're raw enough and safe enough for that level of vulnerability to surface. Because if you were in danger right now, if you were in a situation where you couldn't let that tender part of yourself be seen and heard, you wouldn't surface it. And what it's doing is it's going, I'm bruised, I can't breathe. And what you can reassure it every time, you can mother yourself through it and go, you're going to be okay. This is going to move. We're going to reclaim this energy, because all traumatized energy is dented, wounded energy. And when we're able to invite it back into the body, invite it back into the soul, let it heal, it comes back to us. The fragments, the pieces that have become fragmented, get to come back. So I would look at, what could I do differently in the coming months? What could I increase, or what could I bring in that's new as a healing practice? And I would work very closely with intention, because I think one of the most alarming things, one of the things I found tricky around anxiety and things, I had panic attacks for a kind of year or so. After I was about a year, it didn't start till like I was almost a year out of the relationship. But I had these panic attacks for a while. And one of the things that I really had to do was work with my mind when that was going on, and learn to work with my mind, and learn to develop another voice in there. The voice that was telling me I was going to die, I needed to learn to develop another voice that could talk me through it and tell me I was going to be okay, and that my nervous system was going to be okay, and that I wasn't dying, to kind of hold a space for me. So whether you develop the way you're holding space for yourself in your own mind right now, or whether you change or make an adjustment to the elements in your life right now that you're using to hold space for you while you heal, I would do both of those things. But don't worry about the fact that you're having the replays. They do change, they do calm down, they do move out the more we focus on the intent to heal. So I wish you lots of love and luck with your journey. Noah, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Lee. It was great. My pleasure.
And Marty and Wendy are here as well. They're invisibly behind the scenes. We also have Gianna in the group, and a few more team members who are here to support those of you who come into the Empaths versus Narcissists course 2020. For those of you who've taken the course in prior years, we will give you the free bonus materials that we're adding this year. It's a couple of great interviews. They're about 75, 90 minutes long each. One that's an experience of the dynamic, somebody who really shares their personal experiences. And to many of you that will be known. It's Marty Bradley, who's wonderful, and a team member and a member of our portal community, and a facilitator of our portal community for many years. So those of you in the portal will know Marty well. And also Diana Edwards, who brings her skills as a psychotherapist and someone who has used play and process work to help you get underneath the hood as to how these dynamics started in childhood, and how the dynamics replay. So even if for you it didn't really start in childhood, maybe you had a series of these relationships. So both wonderful conversations that added a lot more perspective and width to what's already a very full course. And what we've learned from prior years is it makes more sense to spread out the process. So rather than giving you too much video and audio content and worksheets all at once, we like to give you a piece and let you digest it for several days, and then we give you another piece. There is no pressure to keep up with the way that we release the modules. Once you're in the course, you will have lifetime access to the course. So you can do it at your own pace, at your own speed. In fact, I highly encourage that. I'm not a fan of being told when I'm supposed to do things. I really trust my own process. So we encourage that too. But for those of you who want to complete the journey, there's enough room and space for you to complete the journey well in about 7 to 8 weeks, 13 modules and the bonus materials, and of course the group support. And of course, the group keep in conversation well after we finish in mid-November. So to those of you who are considering joining the course, we start in a week. We will keep registration open for, I think, a few weeks after we begin. But if you're thinking about it, we really encourage you to start when we start, because there will be a beautiful momentum and everybody will be there together. But if you feel to join us later, before we close registration, we'll look forward to welcoming you. And if you just tuned in for the evening for this broadcast, I send you lots of love with your own journey and your own healing process. And good luck with it. And you've got this. It might just take some time, might just take some understanding, but you can definitely recover. And what you will uncover as you go through that process will be gold, not just for your future relationships with other people, but to reclaim the parts of yourself that you perhaps were giving away, unbeknownst to you, in these dynamics that we have all found ourselves entangled in one way or another at one time or another. Lots of love, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, bye-bye.